thanks for your inspirational refusal to touch donuts, which only validated my determination not to have donuts myself, even though I've encouraged you to have them. Because I will be having pizza right after this ends, so the calories have to be allocated accordingly. So I want to thank you all first for coming and for hopefully engaging in what will be a conversation. I don't want to talk too long. I'll read some bits from the book, and I'll contextualize the book itself and talk a little bit about why I wrote this kind of book, what relevance it has to ongoing, real-time policy developments that affect the lives of everyone in this room and beyond. And then we can open it up for some Q&A. So the idea for this book, if there was one point at which it came to mind to write something like this in my childhood and adolescence, came when my mom told my brother and me that one day we would be writing about our lives. And this came not too long after we had exited the shelter system in New York City. When I was 8 and 9 years old, my family spent a year in the shelter system. We lived first in Chinatown at a shelter on 78 Catherine Street, then at a shelter in Bushwick, Brooklyn. And after the shelter in Bushwick, we were placed into an apartment building in central Harlem with the aid of a housing voucher. And during that period, my mom had to undertake her own reckoning with her own immigrant experience. We had come to the United States. She had come while pregnant with my younger brother, along with my dad, who at the time was of the belief that we would be living in the United States for only a brief period of time while my mom tended to her medical difficulties with her second pregnancy. But then, after my younger brother was born and my mom had medical complications that followed, we decided to stick around for a bit longer. And I'll talk about some of the decisions guiding that eventual commitment to live in New York City in a few minutes. When my mom said that we would be writing our story, I'm not sure she had in mind that we would be writing memoirs, although I suspect that at some future point it dawned on her that at least one of her sons would try to write a memoir. I think she wanted the story of our lives in the States to be presented in very much the standard frame of the immigrant success narrative, right? We had come, we had struggled, we had overcome, we had triumphed, and look at us, right? But as I grew older, one of the issues that I found myself wrestling with was how our efforts to make a better lives for ourselves in the States came at a cost. And so what I spent much of my adolescent and young adult years trying to sort out was what that cost was. How difficult was it on us to make the sacrifices that we had to make in order for my younger brother and I to enjoy the opportunities that we had access to? How much of a sacrifice had my mom had to make? And what were the stakes of that for her as she grew older, as she entered her adulthood and middle and late adulthood? What kind of sacrifices had my dad had to make? What was involved in the communities that came together to support us? What were they sacrificing for us? So all of these were very much on my mind when I sat down to write the book that my mom had anticipated either my younger brother and I would write. But there was one thing that I wanted to foreground in the book, that I really wanted to center. And it was the experience that my family and I had colliding with institutions of power, and specifically institutions of violent power. And when I talk about these institutions, I mean in the first instance the police, and I mean in the second instance the immigration state and immigration enforcement. So the very first incident that is presented in Undocumented is the story of what happened when I was at school, at my high school one afternoon, and received a call from my mom. And so I will just read that episode out to you. Every weekday morning of my high school years, I left my apartment building in Spanish Harlem and took the subway or bus to Manhattan's Upper West Side, where I attended private school. Whenever I wasn't navigating the streets on autopilot, I'd be confronted by the differences between Harlem World and the Upper West, no matter how hard I tried to shut them out. The streets around my Upper West Side private school were mostly clean. The streets in my hood were littered with trash. Broadway had ritzy shops and clean storefronts. 116th Street had 99-cent shops, dusty and crusty storefronts. The Upper West had white kids loitering around Zabar's. My block had black and Latino hood rats loitering outside apartment buildings. And the police. I'd see one or two, or on a truly exceptional day, 3 on Broadway, usually hitting up the bagel spot between 79th and 80th. But the baton-wielding blue rolled deep where I lived. During the school day, my private school made it easy to forget about these differences. Science classrooms decked out with the newest technology, and upper school student center trashed in a way I was beginning to recognize as the mark of entitled brattiness, the guitar and bed-equipped office of my high school advisor. I inhabited daytime spaces that bore not a single trace of that other life I lived on weeknights and weekends. Sometimes, though, that other life intruded into the realm of my immersion in white boy privilege. The hood would come knocking, or just smash through the door. Daniel, the police just searched our apartment for drugs. I took Mom's call outside my school's computer room, where I'd been proofreading the school newspaper. I ignored the first ring of my cell phone, thinking Mom was just calling to ask when I'd be home for dinner. But when she rang a second time, I'd grown worried and picked up. What? What happened? Why did they think we had drugs? They said. Mijo, it's gonna be okay now. They made a big mistake. They had one cop who speaks a little Spanish explain to me what went wrong. They received a call from someone who told them dealers were stashing drugs in an apartment in our building. Cops thought the informant said apartment 2B, so they came to our apartment. So they were there when we got home from church. They knocked down the door. They were searching everything. They searched my bedroom, the table where I had the candles for the Santos, the living room, the kitchen, and the bedrooms. I'm just so happy that your little brother was at chorus rehearsal and not at home. Thank God. Do they still think we're involved in drug dealers? I know me. So they're searching everywhere, and I'm telling them over and over again that they're wrong, that we're a family of God, and I'm just a simple mother raising 2 children. I show them all your books. I tell them you go to a famous private school on full scholarship. But they wouldn't believe anything I told them. They just kept asking where the drugs were. But finally, thank you, Virgin Mary, one of the police officers took out his radio and spoke with the police officer standing outside our building. That's when another cop came up to me and said they were extremely sorry, that it had all been a mistake. They were supposed to be investigating another apartment instead. And you should have seen them then, how nice they were when they realized their mistake. They're even going to pay to have our door fixed. Those sinvergüenza cops, to now, they were doing their job, my son. It's over now. Did they ask about our immigration status? Thank God, no, my son. They didn't ask me for papeles or anything like that. I let out a small sigh of relief. Mom continued, but I must have interrupted you, my son. You're still at school working on the newspaper, right? Everything's okay. I just wanted you to know what had happened. Get back to what you were doing, and I'll see you at home for dinner. Yes, then. I returned to the computer room. All eyes were turned to Britney Spears, who was shaking and dancing on one of the computer screens. One of my friends asked me if anything was wrong. Me? I replied, nah, kid, I'm good. Britney can hit me, baby, all she wants. So I'll stop there for now. And I want to underline a few issues that I thought were important to center in the book by having that be the first story, and also to set the stage for a few other issues that I'll discuss in a few minutes. So the first is that my family's encounters with the police state and the anxieties that this precipitated with and between not just my immediate family, but our extended family, were woven into the tapestry of our lives from a fairly early age. And these encounters were both good and bad. So I focused on one that was bad, that was uniformly, in my view, bad. But there were many moments when this encounter also turned out to have some unanticipated benefits. For example, I mentioned earlier that we spent an entire year in the shelter system. The people who directed us to the shelter system and who set us up to going into the shelter system were the police. And the reason we had been directed to the shelter system in the first place was because after the basement in which we were living flooded, we went to our local police precinct, and our police precinct gave us instructions on where to go to be entered into the shelter system. We went to what was at the time known as the Emergency Relocation Center, just off 149th and 3rd in the Bronx. It also should be stated unequivocally, though, that the older I got, the more menacing I began to view my encounters with police. And this was for two reasons. The first was that as I entered high school, and I'll talk about my process of admission to this private school on the Upper West Side that I mentioned in the opening in a moment, it began to occur to me that depending on what my skin color was or what my immigration background was, I was likely to experience different kind of treatment from the legal authorities. This came across to me even when I was in settings that were marked by the kinds of white boy privilege that I mentioned at the very beginning of the book. So one of the incidents I do not recount in Undocumented occurred when I was a sophomore at this private school on Manhattan's Upper West Side. At this private school, we had fairly flexible schedules, and when you did not have class, you were allowed to leave the school building, wander around, go to the park, get a meal, do whatever you wanted to do. And so, one day in the morning, I left the school building and went around for a walk. And I was stopped by two police officers who thought that I was being truant. And I said to them, "No, I have a free period." And they refused to believe me. They could not believe that I had this free period business. And so they walked me back to my school, at which point they then had it explained to them that, well, yes, this student was correct. He had a free period and he was entitled to be outside. Right? Only that was enough to quiet their skepticism. With that encounter, and with other encounters that occurred during my high school and early college years, the memories of initially favorable interactions with the police, of the kind that I mentioned in connection with the shelter system, faded away. They gave rise to a new set of apprehensions and anxieties that ultimately coalesced around the big and central secret of my life and of my family's life. And this was our immigration status, to which I'll now turn. So why was this such a big and intimidating secret? So as I mentioned earlier, my family came to the States initially for a brief period of time. We came because my mom was having medical complications with her second pregnancy. And in 1989, when we arrived, our expectation was that we would stay in the States only as long as we needed to secure medical treatment for my mom. At which point we would head back to the Dominican Republic, where I had spent the first 4 years of my life very happily, and where my parents had employment, middle-class employment in the capital. When my mom experienced another round of medical complications after giving birth to my younger brother, my parents began to reevaluate this decision. And their reevaluation of the decision to head back, which culminated in a reversal of that decision and a determination to stay in New York City, was motivated in part by a discovery they made. They discovered that I really liked being in New York City, or rather that their eldest son really liked being in spaces such as this one. I really liked libraries with English language books and Spanish language books. And I wanted nothing more than to continue being in these spaces. And even though I couldn't fully verbalize that to my parents yet, because I was 5 and 6 years old, they could tell that I was excited by the experience of being in New York City. I would walk around imitating people because I thought that that was the best way of improving my English. I would imitate everything that came out of other people's mouths, including all the curse words that they used on the subway, which my parents soon found to be one of the most disturbing aspects of raising me in New York City. And in time, this cemented their determination to stay in New York City and raise us here, my younger brother and me. But what they quickly discovered, and what we soon found to be a seemingly insurmountable impediment to being here, was that if you didn't have papeles, and if you did not have legal authorization to work, you were going to have some problems. So in my parents' case, we had come to the States on temporary tourist visas, and when those visas expired, my parents began to seek out advice, any advice, from anyone who could help them figure out how to put the entire family on a secure legal footing. And so they asked around, they asked pretty much every person they knew in their immediate community, and eventually they were directed to a person, a friend of a friend of a friend, who was a very trusted Dominican, who they were told would help them sort out their legal status. But this person, after securing my parents' savings and spiriting away with them, did not sort out their status at all. He was a hustler. He was just a charlatan. He took my parents' savings and he did nothing to change our immigration status at all. And years later, I would discover that my parents' suspicion that he had done nothing was actually true down to the matter of filing paperwork. He had not filed a single item of paperwork on our behalf at all, even though he had repeatedly promised to do this. So my parents at that point said, well, you know, we've just lost all our savings, but it's gonna be fine. My mom in particular is an irrepressible optimist, and so they figured that they would make ends work somehow. The only difficulty at this point was that because they didn't have legal authorization to work, every few months they switched jobs. Eventually there would be a reckoning at their site of employment. People would ask, well, where's your social security number? And it was time to switch it up. My parents at various points were presented with the possibility of buying fake papeles and decided not to. My mom, because she was convinced that it was unethical. My dad, because he was convinced that sooner or later we would be nailed for using fake papeles. But that meant, in practical terms, that every few months they would hop from one form of employment to another, and with that we would also move, because we would usually by that point be falling behind on the rent. So we started out, on arriving in New York City, in Washington Heights, with frequent trips over to Astoria, where my mom's sister lived. And after that, we moved to the Bronx, where we spent the greater part of my kindergarten year. And then we moved to an apartment in Corona, Queens, and then we moved to an apartment in Jackson Heights, and then to another apartment in Jackson Heights, and then to a basement in Elmhurst. And this had all taken place by the time I was in the 3rd grade. So with every move, we picked up, and I left behind the friends that I would make, and my parents would leave behind the friends that they'd made. And we would try to start again. My dad eventually grew fed up with this. He became really frustrated with this because he felt that there was no path to long-term security. He didn't see how we could get papeles, and he, by 1993, had become convinced that there was simply no real value to staying in the United States and continuing to hope after this future that seemed incapable of ever being attained simply because we didn't have the proper immigration paperwork. So he told my mom we should head back to the Dominican Republic. At which point my mom said, you can head back to the Dominican Republic, but I'm staying here. And that occasioned their separation and eventual divorce, because my dad was really true to his word. He just bounced one day. I mean, he booked a flight, and he, at the end of January of 1993, packed up his bags, got on that flight, and headed to the Dominican Republic. My mom tried to make ends meet for another few months while we were still living in this Jackson Heights apartment, but eventually we were evicted, all our stuff was put out on the street. We salvaged what we could and ended up in this Elmhurst basement. When that Elmhurst basement flooded, we then entered the shelter system. While we were in the shelter system, I had a lot of time to kill. I had a lot of time to kill because we had a curfew at the Catherine Street shelter, which meant that we couldn't be out late in the evening. And because I didn't have anything to play with at all. I was in the 4th grade. I have no game system whatsoever. Nothing that could distract my energies in any way, except books. As it turned out, this shelter had one marvelous thing going for it. This shelter in Catherine Street, where my family had been dispatched after spending a few days at the Emergency Relocation Center. And it was that because it was a converted public school building, it still had a functional library. And it was a reasonably well-stocked library. It was about the size of this room. And in the evenings, I would go up to the library and I would try to whittle away the hours after I finished my homework for school. In this library, I encountered a book that really opened my eyes to a field of study, possible subject of interest that I hadn't given any thought to before, at least in any serious way. And it was the history of the Greeks and Romans. Yay! So I'll read you a little bit from the book, and then I'll give you some additional flavor, and then we can talk about it later. One evening, I came across a book in the shelter library entitled How People Lived in Ancient Greece and Rome. I took it down from its shelf and brought it back to our room to read. Most of the front cover and the first few pages were covered in doodles and scrawls, but the opening doodle-free paragraphs of the text were set against illustrations of a man in a toga reading a scroll, a young man strumming the lyre, with another laurel-crowned youth looking on attentively, a black vase decorated with a band of warriors, an open scroll, a spear and shield-wielding warrior, an aqueduct, fortifications, and a temple. The first few sentences grabbed my attention. Quote, Western civilization was formed from the union of early Greek wisdom and the highly organized legal minds of early Rome. The Greek belief in a person's ability to use his powers of reason, coupled with Roman faith and military strength, produced a result that has come to us as a legacy or gift from the past. This legacy has grown and blossomed into a smooth, colorful way of life, covering equally the arts and the sciences, the one and the many. End quote. My eyes were glued to the page. I hadn't had quite that same experience of intense focus from learning about the people and customs of Spain or about the Dominican Republic's presidents, which have been the two other topics that had occupied my energies in the shelter library the preceding 2 months. It had been fun to learn those things. It was even more fun to know that I knew them. But this book talked about a legacy and a way of life. Those words made Greece and Rome seem much more important than anything I'd read about before. The book began with a chapter on sites in early Greece and Rome. There were maps of the Mediterranean at the time of the Roman Republican Empire, regions shaded in blue and purple and orange that were dotted with cities whose names were familiar. Rome, because that's where the Pope lived, Mom told me. Athens, because Dad had once said to me that the most famous Greek philosophers were Athenians. And others that were unfamiliar. Corinth, Mycenae, Thebes. There were descriptions of the climate, followed closely by an end-of-chapter question for further thought. Quote, do you think the locations in which these cultures developed had anything to do with the advanced nature of their civilizations? Why? I paused for a moment, stumped. I was encouraged when I saw that one of the book's previous owners had traced a box around the why. I kept on reading about the invasions of the Persians and the domination of Athens, the Peloponnesian Wars that pitted Athens against Sparta, Alexander the Great and his conquest of the entire known world. With the help of drawings and maps, I imagined what it would have been like to fight in Darius' army, to drink wine at a symposium while poetry was recited, to talk with philosophers. But then a recap question on page 41 left me searching for answers that I couldn't seem to find in the book itself. Quote, in a civilization such as early Greece, where man was so highly respected, why were some people made slaves and treated cruelly? Is it possible for people to act in the same way today? I read about slaves in library textbooks on American history, another topic that also occupied my evening energies. I'd come across the word discrimination and learned about its roots in slavery. Talking to Mom, I'd learned that in Santo Domingo there had been slaves too, Negros from Africa, Indios from the island. The white slave owners had had children with them, black and white slave children, Moreno and Trigueño slave children, and that's why Dominicans now were so many skin colors. Now I was learning that the Greeks had slaves too. All the good things that they'd done to create modern civilization, and they'd had slaves. Next in my new book came the Romans. They'd conquered the Greeks. They'd conquered everyone else in the Mediterranean. I learned that kings had ruled them first, and that, after the kings were kicked out, Rome had become an oligarchic republic, usually headed by consuls, but also in emergencies, by a dictator. The Roman dictator wasn't like a modern one. Not even Julius Caesar was like Trujillo, the longtime Dominican dictator under whom, as I discussed previously in the memoir, my granddad had a very, very bad experience. In my mind, I heard Mom's favorite joke. Desde que Bruto mató a César, los brutos viven sin cesar. So this joke is a little hard to render in English because it relies on a pun. But basically the way the joke is best rendered is, ever since Brutus killed Caesar, brutes have lived without ceasing. which gives you some idea of the pun in Spanish. When Mom first told the joke, I laughed because I felt it was the grown-up thing to do. I didn't really get what was so funny about it, because 9-year-old me was not attuned to puns. Now I got it. I read and reread the book, never returned it to the library. Which is what I always do when I like books. I never return them to a library. This is bad policy. You should always return books to the library. You should always be mindful of the person who might pick up the book after you. This encounter in this shelter library really shifted my approach to the future in all kinds of consequential ways. In the first way was in how it began to spark in me an interest in the study of the Greeks and Romans, an interest that I began to see would require of me immersion in cultures, languages, spaces that were very different from the ones that I was inhabiting at that present moment when I first picked up the book. It also motivated me to begin seeking out the educational opportunities that might make that possible. And here is where I soon found myself at once a beneficiary of an incredible opportunity and at the same time implicated in a problem, a structural problem that we might want to talk about at the very end when we get to the Q&A. The opportunity came in the form of a mentor. When we were living in the second shelter in Bushwick, I encountered a volunteer arts instructor who took a liking to me simply because I sat in the corner and read by myself. See, this is the path to success. Just read by yourself in the corner and good things will happen. While I was reading in the corner, he had approached me and began peppering me with all these questions, and eventually he decided that I really needed to go to the kind of school that would enable me to explore so many of the questions unanswered that I still had on my mind. He was a beneficiary of the New York City private school system. So he had gone to collegiate on Manhattan's Upper West Side and then to Riverdale for high school. And he told my mom about these schools. I translated for my mom. And my mom thought, oh, this is great. Do they have scholarships? He said, yeah, they have scholarships. We can, if we apply, we'll make this work out. After we were placed out of the shelter system and into an apartment in Central Harlem, this volunteer, Jeff is his name, stayed in touch with us and began to help us piece together the materials we needed for applying to private school. And then a second stroke of good fortune intervened. I had a teacher at my Central Harlem Public School, PS 200, that told me about a program called Prep for Prep. And wasn't this program awesome? Because it also promised to secure admission for its participants to one of the private schools, whether day school or it didn't matter to my mom. She just wanted me to go to a better school. And so as the volunteer mentor and my mom prepared applications for me, I also applied to Prep for Prep. And in time, I was admitted to Prep for Prep in the 6th grade. And not too long after I was admitted to Prep, I was then admitted to private school, to collegiate on Manhattan's Upper West Side. So I attended Prep the summer after 6th grade, and then I went to this private school on Manhattan's Upper West Side starting in 7th grade. This private school was phenomenal. It was phenomenal because it provided me with all of these intellectual outlets and all of these opportunities to flex muscles that I had not previously flexed. But it also began to introduce me to a problem, and this problem did not actually become transparently clear to me until I had a conversation about it with my brother some years after the fact. See, my younger brother, like many younger brothers and younger siblings period, was very resistant to the idea of following in his older brother's footsteps at all, and repeatedly fought tooth and nail not to follow in his older brother's footsteps. See, but my mom's willpower could not be bent. And she slowly yet surely wore him down until he capitulated and eventually decided that following in his older brother's footsteps might not be a bad idea. But one of the things that he noticed with a clarity of vision and an intuition that I envy, because it took me forever to connect all these different dots, was that in our being siphoned away from the public school system, in our being taken out of the public school system and entered into the private school system. We were very much a part of what one might call a talent drain, but what would more fundamentally and more correctly be described as a sort of systemic drain on the public school system that had incubated us and had nurtured us up until the time we were in the 6th grade, in my case. And he found this to be problematic on several fronts, one of which was a source of particular consternation to him and to me. As he put it, well, why are you into this whole talented 10th BS? When I asked him to explain, I mean, I knew what he was referring to when we had this conversation. He and I had both read Du Bois, and we had begun familiarizing ourselves with the long history of debate surrounding how folks of color should navigate structures of power that preclude them from accessing opportunity. My brother's essential argument at the time and since was, how do you feel about being complicit in a system that, because it singles you out as exceptional, ooh,
Oh, that's
I like this. Ah,
different. Okay, let's see.
that might be the noon, is that the noon bell?
It's noon, yeah.
Oh,
Straight to noon.
I know that bell when I hear it. So my brother's argument was, how do you feel about being complicit in a system that, because it marks you as exceptional, and because it certifies you and me as being uniquely talented or uniquely gifted, simultaneously enables and perpetuates the continued sidelining of people who are not marked as exceptional, who are not marked as deserving of these unique opportunities? And this is a question for which I did not have an answer at the time of my brother's provocation. It is a question with which I still struggle. It is a question that is intimately bound up with all these other issues that took me many, many years to adequately process, but which are at their core really, really integral to processing the kinds of experiences, the kinds of educational trajectories that folks of color and folks from underrepresented backgrounds have as they make their way through institutions that do not have people like them there. When I entered this private school, I did not have this crisply formulated set of ideas about the kind of experience that was awaiting me yet. I did, however, have interactions with students that led me to wonder whether they were not harboring or whether they were not privy to or subject to certain kinds of racialized, if not outright racist assumptions about the sort of person who had joined them for the 7th grade. So one of my first interactions at this private school came with a classmate who, because I was from Harlem, thought that I would know everything about hip-hop in the world. Now, I knew some things about hip-hop, but hip-hop was banned in my house, so I had to listen to hip-hop tracks outside the crib because my mom said, we can't listen to that música de endemoniados, like that demon music is what she called it. I don't know straight up about that. She was like, none of that business. So my classmate thought that I would know everything about Wu-Tang Clan, because he was obsessed with Wu-Tang Clan. And so I had to pretend to him that I knew everything about Wu-Tang, right? And yes, much later on I would become an expert in all things Wu-Tang. But at the time, I had to put on this masquerade, which, as it later revealed itself to me, was a way of gratifying some pretty racialized assumptions that he was making about me. Right? Here was this white upper middle class kid who thought, oh, the new black kid in this room, clearly he has to know something about hip hop. This is great, I now have a new buddy. Now, there were some ways of trolling this system, I quickly figured out. All of these are not ways that I would recommend to anyone intent on following or even thinking about following in these footsteps. So, when I was in the 8th grade, one of my very privileged classmates told me that he was going to buy weed from someone in the Polo Ground Projects. And I was like, word? You go to projects, huh? He's like, yeah, I got this connect, it's cool, I'm just going to show up. And I could have worded very strongly some cautions about not doing this. But I didn't. Because I was like, well, what am I going to tell him? And provided nothing really awful happens to him, this might make for a good story. Although I was not thinking that rationally. Well, what did happen to him? He went, and they beat us behind. And took all his money, and he didn't get no weed. He didn't get nothing at all. And he came back to school, and he was completely silent about it. He was like, totally mum. He did not want to talk about it. And I felt both vindication and guilt, because I could have, of course, like warned him that this was probably coming this way. But I also felt like, what are you doing, thinking that like you're so sure of yourself that you would just enter this space and just think, oh wow, like I can make this happen, without thinking twice about what might be in your way. Whereas I, on the other hand, felt all the time, especially by the time I was entering high school, that I had to be hyper conscious of where I was, whether it was on the Upper West Side or whether it was in my own neighborhood. That I always had to know who it was that I might be coming into contact with, and what I might need to do in order to prepare myself for that contact. Those incidents aside, the first few years of my time at the school were largely very empowering and very eye-opening. They were empowering because I discovered at the school that I had an ability for languages, and I found the teachers and the mentors there who helped me reaffirm that commitment to languages and helped me develop my interest to the point that it could become something capable of guiding me through the next stages of my high school, college, and post-collegiate career. But as with all good stories, there is a less than good ending. And in this case, it was provided by the escalating realization that my continuing lack of documentation was going to pose a serious problem to the fulfillment of any dreams I had for my future. So throughout this entire time, my status problems had not gone away at all. In some respects, they had become worse. In 1996, legislation had been passed. I alert you again that this legislation was passed under a Democrat president that had really tightened up immigration enforcement. Among other things, this legislation introduced a pretty serious penalty for people who had overstayed visas. It introduced in its late 20th, early 21st century form, the 10-year ban, which works as follows. If you have overstayed a visa for over 180 days, you are automatically subject to a 10-year ban on re-entry to the United States, should you leave, and you are subject to a 10-year ban on adjustment of status. So say that the undocumented 15-year-old me had somehow found a way to transition to a green card status. Well, even if that way were to exist in the abstract legal sense of the term, I would still be precluded from accessing that pathway for 10 years until I had served my time as a consequence of this visa overstay. As I entered the latter stage of my high school career, there was more and more coverage in the news of the scaling up of immigration enforcement. So my mom and I used to watch Univision when I came home from school every afternoon. We had certain rituals, and watching the news was one of them. And one of the things I began to notice in 1998, 1999, 2000, early 2001, was that there was a lot more attention in Hispanic media to people being deported. Now, we knew people who had been deported. One of my relatives had been deported. But it was one thing to hear stories of deportation at a distance, or even to know one or two people who had been deported. And quite another to begin having exposure to news media that insistently emphasized the possibility of your being deported. And by the time I was a junior in high school, this was really beginning to freak me out. I was worried in the first instance about my continuing lack of status, but I was also worried about my mom, who was undocumented, who was working as a cleaning lady, and who I knew was precisely in the kinds of predicaments that might expose her to being rounded up by the immigration authorities. So what was I to do? I was doing some research as best I could. Before there was really Google, there were other search engines such as Alta Vista, Metacrawler, yeah, all these exciting things that are now bit the dust. And what I found through this research was not particularly encouraging. So there were no real options for adjusting my immigration status. There was one option that I only learned about later, and that did not involve marriage or anything like that. Besides, I was still 16. I couldn't get married. That's crazy. So there was this option known as a 245I option. The way 245I worked, the name for it comes from the relevant rubric in the immigration statutes, is that if you had been out of status, all you had to do was declare yourself to the immigration authorities, pay a fairly hefty fine, which we would not have been able to afford at the time, but hey, my mom could hustle, so maybe we would be able to work something out. And after the fine had been paid, you would be allowed to proceed with normal adjustments of status. This 245I provision was allowed to sunset after something occurred in New York City that all of you will know about, and that was 9/11. So after 9/11 occurred, as part of the new wave of regulations that were introduced under the Patriot Act, 245I was allowed to bite the dust permanently. It was ruled out as an option for immigration adjustment. By that time, I was a senior, and with the elimination of 245I, there was really no pathway to legalization for anyone like me. And so that meant, well, that my odds of remaining at an arm's distance from the Immigration Service did not look particularly favorable by the time I was in high school. Given the escalation of enforcement and given the precariousness of my family's position, I figured that sooner or later we would have some interaction that would expose us to the possibility of deportation. And this anxiety intensified after 9/11, when it became clear that because of the introduction of the Patriot Act and the reorganization of the Immigration Service, there would be even more of a likelihood that families like mine, who had no connection whatsoever to the events that had occurred, would nonetheless be singled out. Well, I tried to put on as happy a face about this as I could. I was encouraged by my teachers to apply to college and to apply to Princeton in particular, because I had these language interests and I was particularly interested in Latin and Greek. And one of my teachers, who was and remains one of the most important mentors I've had in life, was of the firm conviction that I would benefit from a Princeton education. But here was where I thought that it was imperative to get some answers to the near-term consequences of my being undocumented. I hadn't told a soul at my high school that I was undocumented. Now, they could have figured it out, because I filled out financial aid paperwork every year, and there was no social security number supplied with that paperwork, so they could have figured it out. But for any number of reasons, they chose not to connect the dots. When I was a junior, though, after sitting on the anxiety precipitated by this for many months, I decided that I just had to tell someone. So I told my college guidance counselor. And I had no idea what his response would be. I mean, he'd been really cool to me up to that point, but I was beginning to discover at that point that if you throw surprises at people, sometimes they do not react in the most favorable way. But he was surprisingly calm when I disclosed this big secret to him. He said that he would see to it that we would work out some resolution. He didn't know what resolution that might be. And I later figured out that he had never dealt with anyone who had been remotely in my situation before. But he promised that we're going to find a way. And so he encouraged me to forge ahead with my plans to apply to Princeton. And eventually, in the fall of 2001, I prepared this application, got everything ready for him. He was going to look it over, and then I was going to send it in. Then he said, I have one more thing to ask of you. And I said, what is this, Mr. Primer? And he said, now is the time when we gotta get some answers to this question of whether your undocumented status will affect Princeton's admissions decision. So this is what you're gonna do. You are going to go to a Princeton admissions officer at this information session that is being held in Midtown, and you are going to approach this officer at the end of the information session. You're gonna introduce yourself, and then you're gonna ask this officer if your lack of immigration status will affect Princeton's decision on your application in any way. When he said this, I was like, I thought to myself, you must be crazy. This is like the craziest thing I've ever heard. Because the idea of outing myself to someone who doesn't know me, and who could, if he or she wanted, just simply report me to the immigration authorities, which is wild. So I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, why even do this? But because this guidance counselor had this sort of mind control over me, eventually he prevailed. And I did exactly as I was told. I went and I sat in the back of this information session, and then at the end of the information session, I went to the officer, I introduced myself. I did exactly as I was bid. I even formulated the question in the exact way in which I had been instructed to formulate it. And this officer said, your immigration status has no bearing on our decision whether to admit you or not. And I said, all right, we're on. And so I sent my application in, and I crossed my fingers. And then a few months later, a nice little letter came in the mail in a thick envelope offering me admission to the class of 2006 at Princeton. Yay! Everyone was excited. It was great. But then other issues presented themselves. The first was that, as I discussed in the book, one of my classmates and I were taking the elevator to our AP Bio class a few weeks after I'd been admitted. And he, as a beneficiary of a very specific kind of upper class privilege, was complaining that his parents' connections were not enough to get him into the Ivy League school of his choice. They were not working out. He really wanted to go to Cornell, wasn't happening, hadn't gotten in, really stressing. And in the midst of this conversation, from which I had zoned out completely because I found this classmate of mine to be a little difficult to deal with, he suddenly turned to me and said, it must have been so easy for you because of this. And he pinched his skin, straight up pinched his skin. Now, what was my first instinct? My first instinct was to slap him. But I knew that were I to do this, I would have gotten thrown out of my school. This would have been very bad, it would have been terrible, and then my admission would have been rescinded, it would have all been sad, right? What really tripped me up about this was that I had, by that point in my high school career, been so obsessed with this image of myself as sort of an ironclad, completely removed from scrutiny applicant, at least according to traditional metrics. I had the grades, I had the board scores. I mean, I wasn't happy with my SAT score, but my SAT score wasn't that bad. I had all these SAT 2 scores. I had APs, I had everything. I had extracurriculars. But that ain't matter to him. He was like, nah, it was easy for you because of your skin color, B. That's what's up. That's what happened. So how to process my anger around this was the question that took up much of the remainder of my senior year. There was also another issue at stake, though, and this now gets back to how I formulated my initial response, in which I began checking all of these indices of merit, right? My grades, my board scores, all that. I was trapped in this meritocratic discourse, too. I mean, I was still encased in it. This idea that, well, if I check off all of these different boxes, then I deserve X outcome or whatever. And at no point up until that very instant had I given substantive thought to the structures that shape the idea of what constitutes merit in the first place. And this was going to take up all my energies in college and beyond. When I got to college, it was clear both that I was in for a blast and that my undocumented status would continue to haunt me. And how my undocumented status followed me around like a specter, like a ghost, is what takes up the final third of Undocumented. The final resolution to my status would not take place until well after college, and in fact did not take place until a few weeks ago. But all of that will be the subject of our Q&A, which should start right now.